Another edition of Outside Shots presented by TheLines.com. You can follow us on X at TheLinesUS. You can follow me at Eli Herskovich, and we'll get to my guest co-host here through the rest of the season in just a moment. But before we get into things, remember that you can use BetMGM promo code TheLines, one word, to get $150 in bonus bets if you bet $5, no matter whether that bet wins or loses. You get $150 in bonus bets with promo code TheLines, one word, Outside Shots, proudly presented by BetMGM. You can find all of our bets in real time in the Lines Discord channel. The link is over at thelines.com in the top right-hand corner. He is Eric Haslam, founder, creator, mastermind behind Haslametrics.com, one of the most esteemed college basketball analytics sites out there. What's going on, Eric?
How you doing? We're getting closer, man. We're what, a couple, 9 days away from the big Thursday and Friday. It's going to be great. Going to be that time of year, conference tournament season kicking in. You know, best time of year for basketball fans.
Absolutely. How are you feeling? You have a headache like Chucky Hepburn after getting run into by Zach Edey on Sunday?
Oh man, it's tough being a Badger fan these days. Thank God we had that 16-4 start, because this has been a tough stretch. I think it's been 3-8 over the last 11. So I'm hoping they kind of get all this nastiness out of their system now, and they're ready to go for the Big Ten tournament and beyond. Every team has a tough stretch. We saw it last year with UConn in January. Maybe this is the tough stretch for Wisconsin. And all of a sudden we see that team that got all the way ranked to number 6 earlier in the season. That's at least what I'm hoping for. Greg Gard usually has them prepared for the tournament. So that's what my fingers are crossed for that.
It's been a while. It's been a while since they've been playing good basketball, but
it's not great. Yeah.
Definitely experienced, and we'll talk Big Ten tournament odds, Wisconsin included, in a little bit. But before we get started, remember to give the video a thumbs up and ring the bell to get notifications whenever the Lines releases a new sports betting video on any market, including our NBA show Coast to Coast. And with us, Outside Shots on TheLines.com podcast, whether it's on YouTube, you can also leave a 5-star rating and review on Apple, Spotify, wherever you find your favorite podcast. So looking at all the odds for the major conference tournaments here in the second leg of Champ Week, Eric, starting off with the ACC. North Carolina sports betting launched in the Tar Heel State, North Carolina, on Monday. So remember, if you're listening to us and you're a resident in North Carolina, haven't signed up for any sports betting promos, you could do so with the best bonus codes over at thelines.com. BetMGM, the ACC Tournament Odds, has Duke plus 190, UNC, second shortest odds after beating Duke on Saturday to clinch the outright ACC regular season championship at plus 200. Clemson plus 700. Wake Forest plus 900. Pitt also plus 900. Virginia plus 1,200 in that disgusting offense. And Vatech plus 2,500. Before we get into my bet for this conference, Eric, I want to get the listeners and viewers a little bit of behind the curtains look at what goes into your projections, not only for this conference and individual games, but Haslametrics in general, widespread college basketball.
Yeah, so what I do from an analytical standpoint is I kind of avoid the 4 factors that a lot of different people are going to use in their analytics. What I end up doing is I broke things down and kind of do a matrix, looking at shot performance, shot selection, and shot situations, and then kind of breaking things down into a matrix like that. Looking at, is a team more likely to shoot the three-pointer? Are they going to take a lot of mid-range shots? Are they going to get close to the rim, what I call near proximity? Then you're looking at the percentage, the performance of all 3 of those, and you're measuring that as well. And on top of that, you're looking at special situations, things that might result in a higher field goal percentage, such as quick points off of second chance rebounds, quick points off of turnovers, things like that. So I'm looking at those opportunities that teams create for themselves. And when you break that all down, you can get a measurement of all these teams and create these transitive comparisons behind the scenes. The example I always use is if Wisconsin plays Michigan and Wisconsin plays Michigan State, you now have a comparison between Michigan and Michigan State using Wisconsin as the constant. Well, you form that one particular comparison early on, and you have tens upon tens of thousands of these comparisons that you form throughout the season. And from that, you're able to come with these, what I call these baseline ratings against the average, the generically average Division I opponent. And when you do that, you can create a projected final for any outcome for any game between 2 Division I teams. And those records, what I call the all play percentage, is exactly what dictates the rankings that you see. So if you see a team that has an all play percentage of 1, which is 1.000, means that they would be favored per my site against every other team in Division I college basketball. And right now there is a team that is that's Houston right now. Not very uncommon. That's not going to say they're going to win every single time. It would say that my analytics would favor them in every single contest on a neutral court.
And as we look at some of the odds for the ACC tournament, not just the ones I mentioned to win the league tournament, but first round games tipping off on Tuesday, along with the Big 12, A10, but we'll touch on Big 12 odds a little bit later on. Louisville, no surprise, and Kenny Payne's retirement tour, I don't know if you want to call it that, or maybe his funeral against NC State. Wolfpack are 8.5-point home favorites, and just for context, if you look at what Haslam has over at his site, NC State, an 11-point favorite. So if you believe, or just below that, I should say, so if you believe the Wolfpack will win by double digits and maybe Haslam has an edge on the actual point spread, we'll see where the number closes, considering it's a 1.5-point differential with the betting odds as of this recording on Monday night. Then maybe you want to take a look at NC State. You probably don't want to take a look at Louisville, though, to win the conference tournament, Eric. One bet that I did make pre-show, going back to Saturday night actually, to win the ACC Tournament Championship was Clemson. And digging into some of their numbers, if you go back to when Jack Clark came back from a multitude of injuries that he suffered in the latter part of, well, it was actually in the beginning of non-conference play, but was out for the majority of the back end of non-conference play and then about the first half of ACC play. And ever since he came back healthy into the starting lineup against UNC, which Clemson won at the Dean Dome for the first time in ever against the Tar Heels on February 6th, Clemson ranks in the 85th percentile at both ends. So offensive and defensive efficiency, some of the metrics that you brought up, which is pretty good. And that has a lot to do with what Clark brings to this team, especially at the defensive end, his ability to switch 1 through 5. And Clemson can also create mismatches 1 through 5 offensively with Hall, Shefflin, and Clark able to space the floor. You also think about the bracket and the way this is going to be laid out for Clemson. You get the winner of Boston College and Miami in the finals, or actually in the first round, wouldn't be finals on Wednesday's slate. Potentially the finals if Clemson loses that game. And then you face Virginia in the quarterfinals, the Who's knocked out Clemson last year in the ACC semis, and Clemson lost to them by a point earlier this season. So a lot of motivation going into that game. Also just shows you the kind of negative variance that Clemson got in some of their ACC regular season games. Speaking of 1-point losses, they lost to Duke in the regular season at Cameron Indoor. Questionable foul call late, leading to that defeat. Potentially playing Duke in the semis, and then we'll see who comes out of the top half of the bracket. Projection-wise, it would be UNC, but I like the odds that I got at 15-1. 10-1, I still show value on. I would bet them probably down to like plus 850. I make them closer to plus 750, so that's about an 11.7% implied probability. Plus 1500 was 6.25% implied probability. So I had a pretty good edge on the Tigers to win the conference tournament. Now we'll see, motivationally speaking, what that means to them, something that you and I were touching on over text. Do teams like Wake Forest and Pitt have a little bit more motivation just because they likely need to win the league tournament or at least a couple games in order to advance and get into the big dance? But what are your overall thoughts here on the ACC tournament, Eric?
Well, I'm still a big North Carolina guy, and I talked about this was the first team I put a future on to win the national championship was North Carolina. I thought they were going to be this year's UConn. Now, they don't have the fingerprint of UConn offensively. They need to do better. They need to be a top 10 offense to be in my opinion, be a national champion. They're not quite there yet, but they do actually have something to play for. We've talked earlier about my concerns about I don't like to wager so much on these major conference games because certain teams don't have something to play for. It's more bragging rights for a lot of them. They know where they're going to land, a lot of them. With North Carolina, might actually have a shot at a 1 line. So they might be motivated on that one. It's going to make for an intriguing semifinal game there because you're going to have Pitt potentially with Wake Forest, two teams who are desperately needing a win on the bubble. So that's going to be two teams like we had talked about. There's going to be some hungry teams that are going against a North Carolina team, which I don't know if they have something to play for. Does it matter to them that they're going to be the 1 seed or the 2 seed? But it's going to be right around that line. If they're motivated to win that 1 seed, then I think they are far and away the best team to win this conference tournament. If you look on the other side of the bracket, I like Duke. Duke is another team I have a future for the NCAA tournament. Virginia, when you get to the bottom of that, I could definitely see why you'd pick Clemson there, because Virginia, you don't know what you're going to get. They have, for a good chunk of the last month, they have been dead last, 362nd in my consistency metric. They're all over the map. And I think they had a string there of, I think it was 5 straight games. I think it was 7 of 8 where they had positive ratings above their season norm. It seemed like Virginia was all of a sudden kind of turning a corner. But then after that, now all of a sudden they've missed the mark. 4 games out of 7. They've lost 3 of 5. It's just really hard to trust this Virginia team. I've seen these teams in the past, and sometimes you can come to these tournaments, and we saw this 2 years ago with North Carolina, one of the most inconsistent teams 2 years ago, and they made a run all the way to the championship game. But for me, more times than not, these inconsistent teams, they'll have a good game and then a bad game. You just really can't trust them in any given night. I'm still going with the favorites in this one, North Carolina and Duke. I still like North Carolina, assuming they have the motivation to get the 1 seed. I still think deep down, that's my team that I really want to be like this year's UConn in the tournament. But like I said, they just don't have the fingerprint offensively to be the national champion right now, in my opinion.
I want to go back to what you said about Virginia too. I don't want to I guess I will call them lucky. Just from what we saw in some of their regular season games, you have an overtime win against NC State, Notre Dame. And that was before Notre Dame really started to peak. A 1-point win over Clemson on the road that I mentioned, a 4-point win over Florida State, 2-point win over Wake Forest. So these are a 4-point win over Boston College in the third to last game before this ACC tournament. So these are 2 possession wins that, generally speaking, are coin flip games. And when you have a team that plays at such a slow tempo, you are kind of fortunate to get in these kind of circumstances. And they're not a good free throw shooting team. So if you play in close games, 350th in the country in free throw percentage, Dunn and Beekman are probably pros, but still not a lot of upside, especially in a game that's going to be shortened possession wise. And don't want to trust this offense, even if you like Tony Bennett schematically with that pack line defense in a tournament setting. The other things that I want to say with Duke and UNC really quickly, a couple of reasons why I don't love them long term. UNC has shored things up defensively, but they rank 324th in open 3-point rate attempt allowed. So giving up a lot of open threes, that has a lot to do with Baycott's ball screen defense. And with a non-agile 5 on the floor, you tend to give up more threes. That's a bit of a concern for me for a team that still may face some negative regression from behind the arc defensively. They only allowed a 30.7% clip in ACC play. And then Duke, like we saw against UNC on Saturday, giving up a decent amount of second chance opportunities, owned on the glass in that game, which we've seen against more physical competition. And then they got exploited in transition, which really hasn't happened in a while, but they also haven't faced that tough of ACC competition. And then when you go back to some of their earlier season games, like against Arkansas and Arizona, they got exposed with their fast break defense. So just a couple issues. Maybe UNC or Duke wins the ACC tournament. Maybe this isn't a letdown for UNC after the Duke win on Saturday, but a couple of reasons why I'm not as high on those 2 teams juxtaposed to the market.
Yeah, it's for me, I look at it and go, I was waiting for North Carolina. They looked so unbeatable earlier on in the season. Then they kind of had that lull, like we talked about before. UConn last year in early January, I think, even had that lull where they lost something like 4 or 5. For North Carolina, it was losing 3 of 5. They didn't look like the same team. They slipped in offensive efficiency and defensive efficiency, but now they seem to have turned it around. 4 positive performances in their last 6 games. All 6 are wins. It's just kind of, you never know what's going to happen. Are they peaking too soon, or are they now just getting in that groove, kind of similar to San Diego State last year, who flew into the Mountain West tournament, rolled through that, and then won 5 games en route to losing in the final of the NCAA tournament. Sometimes you compete too early, but sometimes you're just finding your groove. And just looking at what North Carolina was able to do earlier this season, going back into December up until the end of January, that was such a dominant team. They slipped for a little bit, but now it seems like they've sorted things out. I like their long-term outlook.
And looking at that projected matchup that you mentioned in the semifinals, it would be UNC is about a 5-point favorite over both Pitt and Wake Forest. My question for you is, and I know I kind of shot down Pitt on a couple podcasts ago just because Jack Clark, who I mentioned for Clemson, did a great job guarding Blake Hinson. And I mean, Pitt needs Hinson to get going from 3 if they're going to want to upset UNC in that potential matchup. Along with, you have a high variance team in the Panthers. So would that potential regression concern you at all for UNC's perimeter defense against a team like Pitt that is so 3-point heavy?
That's really hard to say. Anything could happen. Anything could happen in these tournaments. It's really hard to ballpark exactly what's going to happen. I've gone out there and I've projected these teams to be 3-point heavy and just drain everything in sight. And then all of a sudden they go 1 of 17 out of the blue. The weird things happen in conference tournaments. So in that situation, it would be really difficult to say. I will say this about Pittsburgh. I think Pittsburgh has a far better resume than a lot of people are giving him credit for. I think, that's one of the teams that I actually have in the field and most people probably don't. So I think they have more to play for. And I think a lot of Pitt fans would probably agree with me, obviously, but, it's going to really be dependent on if they can get past Wake Forest. If Wake Forest takes them out, I'm pretty sure Pitt's a goner. But it'll be interesting if Pitt all of a sudden gets a win over Wake Forest and North Carolina, assuming those games actually do matter to the committee, which is a question mark. It's a big question mark. If Pitt goes a long ways and then say loses in the final, is it going to make a difference to the committee? I think Pitt has a pretty good resume and deserves better credit, but I'm probably in the minority on that one.
Maybe if they beat UNC hypothetically in the semifinal, just because we saw Clemson get the double bye in the ACC tournament last year. They lose to Virginia in the semifinal, don't get to the ACC title game at the least, and then you don't get a bid in the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, right. And the one I think of, like, too, I was tweeting about this earlier. Texas A&M, remember a couple of years ago, Texas A&M was a team that was right on the bubble, and they beat Florida, who was right around number 50, and then back to back they beat Auburn, and they beat it was Auburn and Arkansas back to back, and they lose in the final to Tennessee. That is the kind of thing that I'm like, a lot of people thought that was going to get them in the tournament, but it didn't. And that's where I'm kind of like, that's why I'm always kind of doubting about anything that happens after like Thursday night into Friday morning. It's like, does it really matter at that point? Now, at that point, will they have enough under their belt? If the game they play against, for example, if Pittsburgh beats Wake Forest and then the game against North Carolina would be on Friday, would it happen early enough that the selection committee would actually take it under consideration? That's a big question mark. I don't know for sure about that.
Not that I want to stay on the topic of at-large teams, but really quickly, just because of what we saw in the Missouri Valley Conference Tournament Championship with Drake holding off Indiana State in the final few minutes. I think Indiana State faced as large of a 18-point second-half deficit. What do you make of the Sycamore's chances?
Well, the Sycamore, oh boy, that's going to be problematic because it's going to be one of those situations where everybody's going to look at the record and they're going to say, come on, look at this, a team that's 28-6. But when you look at the stuff that's there that is valued by the committee, there is not a lot of meat on that bone. A lot of people are saying basically the win, you're hanging your hat on a win over Drake. There's a lot of people, let's face it, they all want to see Robbie Avila. That's the big motivation behind the people that want to see Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in the NCAA tournament. Unfortunately, it's really going to be really dicey for them. I think they're right around the cut line right now. For me, they're basically second team outside the field. Now that can work in their favor, it can work against them, because if those teams that are currently in the field all of a sudden start falling off again, which they very well may do if Wake Forest loses to Pitt, and Pitt's too far below Indiana State. If Texas A&M fails, if Villanova falls, all of a sudden this is all going to help Indiana State. The question is there going to be a team out there that can come out of the blue like a UNLV, who's not supposed to be in the tournament, all of a sudden wins the Mountain West and steals a bid and knocks Indiana State down a notch? Is that going to be a problematic? I think Indiana State, at this point, probably has a pretty good shot at being in the discussion for a play-in team in Dayton. That's what feels right to me at this point.
On to the Big 12 tournament, looking at those odds courtesy of BetMGM. Houston minus 165, so pretty heavy odds-on favorite just when you think about the injuries that they're going through, and we'll get to a couple big injury notes here in a moment. Iowa State plus 400, Baylor plus 800, so 8-1, BYU 10-1, Kansas plus 1,500, Texas Tech 20-1, Texas 25-1, TCU 50-1, and Oklahoma, Porter Moser might be heading to DePaul, the current Sooners coach. DePaul, my alma mater. The only nice thing I'll say about the Blue Demons is if they hire Porter Moser. The Sooners are 80-1. So the injuries that I wanted to get to, Hunter Dickinson, dislocated shoulder. That's what the reports were coming out of that Saturday blowout loss at Houston, in which the Cougars clinched the outright Big 12 regular season championship. Dickinson nor Kevin McCullough are going to play in the Big 12 tournament. That was reported a couple hours ago before we started recording here on Outside Shots, and you could kiss Kansas's Big 12 tournament odds goodbye with that being the case, especially with a zone-heavy Baylor defense. That matchup theoretically taking place in the semifinal. Baylor would be the look for me, Eric, just because of the defensive scheme, and then you play Iowa State in the semis. So Kansas in the quarters, Iowa State would be in the semis. That's a great matchup. Iowa State ranks 5th, bottom 5 in the conference, and 3-point percentage. Kansas, I think, ranks 11th, and Cincinnati ranks in the bottom tier as well when it comes to 3-point shooting in Big 12 play. Also, Langston Love being healthy for this team, coming back from the ankle injury, and you already have really good floor spacers in Ray J. Dennis, Jacoby Walters, pro prospect, and Jalen Bridges, too, one of the better and more efficient floor spacers at the 4 spot in college basketball. This isn't your prototypical Scott Drew team just because they're elite offensively and very subpar defensively, but the zone has kind of covered that up as Drew has adjusted throughout the season. So it would be Baylor 8-1 or pass for me. I'm going to stay away from this tournament, but what say you?
I think it's going to be about the same thing. I like what you're thinking about that one. I think Baylor can easily get to that final. I'm looking at the situation. It's going to be interesting on the other side with the injury situation with Texas Tech. I know that they're having they got a foot injury for Warren Washington. Kyron Lindsey's got an injury, but then all of a sudden we're talking about depth issues for Houston. I've been talking about this for the last few weeks now. At what point is Houston going to start getting into some danger with depth? Because, going back to December, you lost Terrence Arsno with a torn Achilles. In February, you lose Ramon Walker, torn meniscus. And now all of a sudden, JoJo Tugler's out for the year with a foot fracture. So my question about Houston is first of all, I don't like their long-term outlook because of the offense. I mean, their defense is fantastic, no question about it. But the offense is not elite, not at least as elite it was a year ago. And the question is the depth going to catch up with them? Now you have two teams there that are going to have some injury issues, potentially Texas Tech and Houston. Houston probably gets through that one, in my opinion. But I like the fact that the injuries probably drop their stock enough that it looks like the best bet here is probably going to be Baylor, like you said. Iowa State, I think you got to put them in the mix. You got to give Otzelberger credit for what he's done with this team. I had my doubts even going back to January, thinking when they really did not have a strong strength of schedule. Them, BYU, Oklahoma were 3 teams. I was like, I don't know. I think they all might fall. It seems like of all those 3, Iowa State obviously came through head and tails above the rest of them. So credit to him. I can't really sell them short, but again, I have, in the back of my mind with Iowa State, I always remember that 22-2 started that game against Pittsburgh last year in the NCAA tournament. It always sits there. The offense is far improved this year compared to last year, but still it's a defensive minded team. Defense wins games and even conference championships, but doesn't win national championships. Offense wins national championships.
And I want to go back to your point about Houston, just because you alluded to this from the get-go, and then you brought it up too. If one of our listeners or viewers were to check out Haslametrics.com, Houston, quote-unquote, power-rated efficiency-wise, and per all the other metrics you use, as the number 1 team on your site. Mm-hmm. And you look at the betting odds board, second shortest odds to UConn, who we'll touch on when we get to the Big East tournament. Purdue, third shortest odds to win it all. Houston in the plus 600 range. But just to kind of clarify that for our listener and viewer here on Outside Shots, that you're not necessarily high on this team, not only in the Big 12 tournament, potentially motivationally speaking, but also come the big dance.
Yeah, the reason why is because I've kind of done the study in the past of looking what's the fingerprint of a team of a national champion. Top 10 offensive efficiency, top 35 defensive efficiency. No question defense. But I'll give them credit. They have gotten better offensively. This was a team that was probably right around 25th a few weeks ago. They're up to 14th for me. So they're climbing closer to that range where they could be considered a national champion. If you look at the ratings on the last 7 games they've played, 6 of them have outperformed their season norm on the offensive end. So they're climbing in that regard. But as I've said, the one thing that really is sitting there is looking at those 3 injuries. And then granted, these guys are not exactly huge scorers in the past. You know, Arsenault, of the 3, they lost Arsenault in December. He was averaging 6 a game. Tugler is averaging 4 a game. Ramon Walker 2. But these are plug-and-play guys in Kelvin Sampson's defensive machine. And that's the thing. You're going to be asking a little bit more from these starters and these key reserves. And the question is how much depth? You know, how long can you go when you're going to be asking these additional minutes? It's a similar situation to a lot of, people throw the same question out there about Creighton, about their depth. And I think before now, Houston had enough, but I think, how many straws does it take to break the camel's back? I think that's the question that I would ask right now about Houston's long-term prognosis.
Absolutely. You go back to an overtime win over Texas in late January for the Cougars. Tugler off the bench. Again, thinking about an overtime game, so you're trying to rely on depth a little bit more so than you maybe would, and also foul trouble for a team that plays so physically on the defensive side of the floor, and when you're trying to crash the glass, you could pick up a cheap foul here or there. Tugler played 19 minutes, 5 boards, 4 points, and this is also a Cougars team that ranks, I think, top 10 on your site in near proximity field goal percentage. So that has a lot to do with them crashing the glass, which Tugler was a big part of, not only in that game, but as his minutes started to rack up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's going to be the problem long term. Granted, you can't deny what they did. Granted, the Kansas situation was a little bit, obviously they win that game by 30. They look fantastic. But at the same time, you lose Dickinson. You don't have McCullough. It's not exactly the Kansas team you expect to see in that game. So the interesting thing about that is, even though they're overperforming on the offensive end the last few games, they're actually starting to underperform a little bit on the defensive end. Now, granted, how can you not, considering how fast out of the gates it came? They were at one point maybe better than the Virginia teams of like 5 years back defensively, still in that conversation. But the last few games, they just seemed to pull back a little bit. They gave up 85 points at Oklahoma. So that was one game that really jumped out at me. They gave up 76 to Baylor and overtime 65 at Iowa State in a very defensive matchup. But the Kansas game was a very positive outcome for them, but understandably so, considering the situation with Dickinson and McCullough.
And when you go back to that Houston-Oklahoma game where they give up 85, they get bailed out by Jamal Shedd, who was hurt later on in that game. I will say it was a courageous effort from him, just considering he hits the walk-off jump shot to win the game for the Cougars at the buzzer. But Oklahoma shot 48% from 3. Now, you can consider that high variance and maybe just luck-based for the Sooners when you look at their overall three-point efficiency numbers, middle of the pack in Big 12 play and across college basketball. So big game for them, trying to upset one of the best teams in college basketball, if not the best. Sometimes that brings out the most variance in a conference. I don't even want to call that a rivalry game, but just a meaningful conference game, especially for Oklahoma's NCAA tournament hopes at that juncture a couple weeks ago. But those are the teams that have given Houston the most problems. Yes, if you go back, not that I want to spend so much time on the Cougars' NCAA tournament hopes, but you go back to that Villanova game in the Elite Eight a couple years ago. Now, that was a 50-44 game, and you want to talk about negative variance. Houston shot 1 of 20 from 3 in that one. Villanova only 5 of 21 from 3, but they were an elite shooting team. They always have been, or at least under Jay Wright, and they hit huge shots down the stretch when it mattered most. You have to be able to hit contested shots, especially against this defense. Villanova did it. Those are the kind of teams, like we saw with Miami last year against Houston in the Sweet 16, that could really give them fits just because they really pack you in. And when you could beat them in transition to the corners or to around the arc in general, you can have success.
And you talked earlier about Oklahoma. I mean, it's how it matches up this year. Look who's going to be playing Houston in their first game. It's going to be Oklahoma, the team that took them to the limit, lost that game by 2, or it's TCU, one of the 3 teams that have actually beaten Houston this year. So kind of sets up pretty interestingly there. You got some stiff competition potentially for Houston there in their first game.
On to the Big East Conference tournament. Looking at the odds board over at thelines.com, and per BetMGM Sportsbook, UConn a heavier favorite than Houston to win actually tied for the same odds to win their respective conference tournaments. Huskies are priced at -165, plus 475 in that range to win the national championship. You can price shop over at thelines.com. Creighton plus 375, Marquette plus 650. I don't think I've seen anything new on Tyler Kolek's oblique injury, whether he's going to play or not. You would expect no, but that's just my hunch. St. John's plus 1,200, Villanova plus 1,200, Seton Hall 40-1, Providence 80-1. What stands out to you, Eric, on the surface?
Well, one of them, Creighton, first of all, is one of my futures. I like Creighton a lot. Again, the depth issue is something that bothers me, but they do have the fingerprint of a national champion with the top 10 offensive efficiency, top 35 defensive efficiency. On top of that, you mentioned the Kolek injury. You wonder if Shaka Smart, who has not exactly had the most luck in the NCAA tournament since the VCU run, is starting to a little bit of pressure and saying, do I really want to put all my eggs into a Big East tournament basket when the NCAA tournament is knocking? Do you really want to have Tyler Kolek 100% healthy for the NCAA tournament, knowing full well that Marquette probably doesn't have a lot to gain here in the Big East tournament? So that would probably bode well for Creighton, considering they match up with number 3 Marquette in the semifinals. On the other side, obviously, UConn just looks like that dominant train that they had a year ago. I don't like I can't say I don't like, but, the thing I loved last year about UConn is not only did they have shooters, but you had that 2-headed monster on the inside with Sanogo and Klingon. Now, obviously, Klingon's still there, and you're playing with Samson Johnson. Not exactly the same 1-2 punch, but still, it's really hard to bet against UConn. My one reason I can't get on UConn is it's really hard to win back-to-back national championships, and that kind of sticks in my head why I don't really want to go that route. But when you look at I was looking at this earlier, when you look at the fingerprint for UConn this year, and you compare it to last year, in some areas, UConn's even better than they were a season ago. I mean, when you're looking at field goal percentage right now, their 10th adjusted field goal percentage on my site, they're 10th in the country. They finished 21st last year. They're number 1 in offensive efficiency. They were number 2 last year. They're making their mid-range shots. That's not a shot they were able to make last year. A lot of the other stuff, you look at it and it's very similar. And if you say to yourself, if the numbers are similar and you saw the results in the NCAA tournament last year, why would the same thing not unfold again? It very well could. It's just one of those things for me where it's just hard for me to pick the champion 2 years in a row. I don't think the NCAA champion's been the same since, correct me if I'm wrong, Florida, going back to, I want to say 20 years ago. That's the one thing that sticks in my head. But, as far as winning the NCAA or the Big East tournament, obviously within grasp. I just like on the other side of the bracket, probably I'm looking at Creighton over Marquette just because Marquette doesn't have so much to play for, in my opinion.
Yeah, and going back to that Providence, speaking of the Friars, for UConn over the weekend, great spot for Providence they're going to need a deep Big East tournament run now, even though it's not like a situation where St. John's is on the bubble, probably on the right side of the bubble at this point, but Big East tournament games are considered home games for them when it comes to net ratings and quad 1, quad 2, wins, losses, whatever it may be in the Big East tournament. But back to the UConn Providence game for the weekend, Stefan, just to your point about talent level and what they're doing on both sides of the ball, Stefan Castle, 14 points, 6 boards, 3 assists, 4 steals. He's not mimicking Andre Jackson and his two-way prowess because he's not as good of a passer, but it's close. The jump shot efficiency has to improve, especially in the half court for this team in the tournament. I'm curious to see how that goes, but he is elite in transition when it comes to his decision-making and getting to the basket. I think you could argue that Cam Spencer, this may piss off UConn fans, but I think the case could be made that Spencer is a better fit and it's very close. It's like great and great times a little bit more. the difference between Spencer and Jordan Hawkins for me is right there for what they mean in Hurley's motion offense. And the spacing is just so good. Caravan has also found his shot. My issue, if I wanted to take a dart here on one team and a team that started to peak, which has kind of been the trend that we've talked about ahead of conference tournaments when you're looking for maybe a little bit bigger odds across any tournament, St. John's at 12-1 per BetMGM. The transition defense is still a huge liability for this team, despite winning 5 games in a row to end the regular season. They rank in the 6th percentile of percentage points allowed on fast break since February 21st, which was at the start of this 5-game winning streak. So it's not like they fixed their biggest liability. They would get UConn in the semifinals if you can beat Seton Hall for the first time all season. And I hate the stupid crutch that, you can't beat a team 3 times in a row. Well, how many times has it happened so far in some of these conference tournaments? Just look at Drake against Bradley in the MVC tournament. They've swept them for now, I think, their last 4 or 5 straight games. But the St. John's transition defense, even though I have Final Four futures on them, and by the way, I like Creighton. I have a title bet on them going back to the preseason. I worry about depth with them too.
Yeah, absolutely. The other team I'm going to throw out there that we might be forgetting about is Villanova in this tournament. Granted, they've lost 2 in a row, but look what they're facing in the first round. They're playing DePaul. They might as well be playing 5 guys down the street from my house. Then you're playing Marquette, what we talked about, which like we talked about with the injury with Kolek and the motivational factor. So I've always looked at it and said a lot of times with any tournament, it really relies on the matchups to see what's going to happen. If you're going to have an easier path through 2 games, all of a sudden they might come in there just a little bit fresher into a semifinal game against a Creighton or against a Providence that sneaks through against Creighton. You never know. So I'm not a huge fan of Villanova this year. I've always kind of thought their ceiling is there, but they just have not, just for whatever reason, just haven't delivered. But considering the situation they find themselves in this tournament, playing DePaul, playing Marquette, I think there's a path there that Villanova can actually surprise and actually get to the Big East final. I don't know if they're going to take it all, but if they go against UConn, that would be a tough ask. But still, I think there's a path for them ahead of them.
Yeah, and you're betting on variance, whether it's Villanova or Creighton, for that matter, come the NCAA tournament. See, that's why I'm glad you brought up Villanova. That's why I don't necessarily like Creighton in this conference tournament. Is you're talking about the second shortest odds here. I kind of make my numbers kind of make this in line with the odds that are available right now for Big East tournament, and especially with the Jays. So whether they're on like they were against Villanova in the regular season finale, or you have an off night like they did against St. John's, and it's not like the Johnnies are playing Creighton in this tournament, to my point earlier, where you're getting that Kalk-Brenner drop coverage, which is where St. John's offense lives for Pitino in the mid-range with Jenkins and Dingle. But back to Creighton and Villanova for that matter. Villanova had a little bit longer odds, so that's why maybe if you want to take a dart on them. But an off night from shooting-wise with Creighton, and they're toast.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing, is they rely so heavily on that 3-point game. But the fact of the matter is that they found a lot of success doing that last year as well. And that's the kind of thing that you bring in Stephen Ashworth, who really just, again, plug and play, perfect fit for the system. 35th in 3-point attempt rate, 35th in adjusted 3-point percentage. They shoot the mid-range well, although they avoid it as much as possible. 8th in the country in offensive efficiency. Obviously that's always the downside with these teams. I still think you need to be able to shoot well. Obviously, when you rely on the three-pointer that heavily, it is a little bit of a concern. You like to see a little bit of diversification, but at the same time, if they can do that reliably, and they've proven they can be a threat, as they showed last year in the NCAA tournament.
I want to go back to one potential matchup that you brought up with Villanova and Marquette in the quarters. So your site has it projected at Marquette -3, but just for clarification purposes for anybody that may go to your site and check out the odds versus what the market may be at, that doesn't incorporate the Kolek injury, correct?
That is correct. Yeah, so my site just uses teams kind of as a quote-unquote constant. It doesn't look at the individual parts. So people will ask that of me all the time and say, does this include the injury? And my answer is not proactively. And by saying not proactively, a lot of times injuries do get cooked in because if a guy is missing for 5 or 6 games, those performances are being considered. So that gets brought into the equation, but those proactive injuries, nothing is there. So this is why I always say, take analytics with a grain of salt. Know exactly what you're looking at. Use them as evidence at a crime scene, but it's not an open and shut case. Use your eyes and make the adjustment accordingly.
Right. And let's say the market is Villanova pick, which I don't think it may surprise some of our audience, but I don't think it would be that crazy. Maybe Marquette -1, whatever the line may be for anybody that's saying, okay, well, Marquette is -3 on Eric's site. Keep what Eric said in mind about it's across pretty much every analytics site, whether it's Haslam, KenPom, Torvik. None of these major analytics sites are diving back and adjusting their numbers for an injury. Think about how much time that would take too for you every night.
Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing is like, what kind of injury are we talking about? There's so many different levels of injury. I mean, a mild ankle sprain, all of a sudden, if the guy wakes up and he's throwing up in the morning, how do you possibly plug that in? You can't possibly do it. So that's why I always kind of look from an analytics standpoint. I've always said, and I've used to pin this to my site, and I said, sports analytics should be like digging a grave. 6 inches is not enough, but 600 feet is just plain overkill. I'm the kind of person who likes to dig 6 feet. There's other people who like to go 12, 18, 20 feet, whatever. There's a time where I think we dig too far and I look and go, I'm looking for the 98% answer, because the other two is there's so much unknown. You could dig all day long and you're probably not going to find it. These situations like day-to-day illnesses, things like that. Who knows what kind of bad day he woke up on the wrong side of the bed. That kind of thing happens to all of us. It happens to college kids. They're even more emotional than we are as adults. And that's just something that you just can't incorporate. They're intangibles. You can't put them into metrics.
If you want Eric to spend the rest of his life at his computer and adjust his model every day for injuries, if we get 100 comments on YouTube, Eric will do just that. I'm just kidding, I think. But remember, if you want to find out bets throughout the conference tournaments, you can do so in the Lines Discord channel. Link is over at thelines.com in the top right-hand corner. Steven Andres and Derek Wagner will have bets for you throughout the week over there. Moving on to the Big Ten tournament odds in Minneapolis. Pretty close to you. You're up in Wisconsin. I'm in Chicago. And looking at the odds per BetMGM, Purdue -185, so a heavier favorite actually than UConn and Houston in their respective conference tournaments. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, which we'll get to in a second. Nebraska +500, Michigan State +600, Wisconsin. Your Badgers 10-1, Iowa 18-1, Ohio State 20-1, Indiana 35-1, Maryland 50-1. So before I get into my bet for this conference tournament, Eric, the reason why I brought up what I said with Purdue is, what is the motivation for this team? I'm not saying they don't want to win back-to-back Big Ten conference tournaments, but you have your eyes set on March, especially after what happened last year.
Right. And that's the concern. Is Purdue going to be thinking about that? I mean, Purdue, granted, look at what Purdue, you could say, well, Purdue won it last year. But look, do you remember what Purdue faced to win the Big Ten title? They won. The best team they faced was their first opponent. That was the 9 seed. That was Rutgers. I think they faced in the semis, it was 13 Ohio State, and then it was 10 Penn State in the final. So, I looked at that and almost like reluctantly, Purdue won the whole thing, because what else were they going to do? They weren't going to face any real competition. And I don't know, does that wear you out? I don't know. That's always the thought, is these teams that actually make a run in these conference tournaments, all of a sudden, does that hang with you 3 or 4 days later? If you get 3 games in a row, I don't know. So that's going to linger, I'm sure, with Purdue. And if they face, they could have the same situation. What if, obviously if you're looking at a Maryland team that gets by Rutgers, well, Wisconsin's not playing great basketball. I kind of joked today. I said Maryland's probably going to run through Wisconsin, and Wisconsin will be in the pool on Friday, all rested up, saying, well, we got a 6 seed. Who cares? And then all of a sudden Maryland goes through Northwestern. You could have the same situation where Purdue takes down a Minnesota or a Michigan State and then gets a Maryland. And then who knows what happens in the other side? They may go 3 games again. Now, I don't think it's going to be this. Obviously, it's easy for me to say it's not going to be the same situation as Fairleigh Dickinson last year. The guard play, another year of experience for these guys. Lance Jones is a big, huge upgrade over Brandon Newman from a year ago. Zach Edey is a better basketball player. It's not going to happen. I mean, if it does, I will start tracking every single injury in college basketball if Purdue loses in the first round to a 16 seed. Ain't going to happen. Ain't going to happen this year. But at the same time, what does Purdue have to play for? There's 3 teams who are locked in on that one line no matter what they do tomorrow. Nothing can change that. It's Purdue, it's Houston, and it's UConn. So what's the motivation for Purdue? I mean, you have to ask yourself that. I mean, if I'm Purdue, the thought is going through my head. I mean, what's our motivation? Bragging rights? Is that really what it is? I mean, that's what it comes down to. And so you got to think about that when you're kind of handicapping these games. What's the motivation for Purdue? And my first thought was, well, they did it last year. But then when I took that closer look, I was like, well, the best team they faced was the 9 seed in the conference. That was it. So if they face some stiffer competition and all of a sudden you play a hungry Northwestern team or you get Illinois in the final, are they going to get through that? I mean, at that point, once you're in the final, they're going to go all out. The question is, are they going to be motivated for a team like, for example, Michigan State? Michigan State, high ceiling, hungry team, or should be hungry, considering they're on the bubble now. They should never have been here, but here they are. All of a sudden, they look and go, this is our big chance. If we lose this game, we could be left out. Who would have seen that coming? The question is Purdue going to have a lot of motivation for that game with Michigan State if it happens?
I want to go back to your point about Edey, and I know I joked earlier or to start the podcast with him trucking through Chucky Hepburn. I mean, the calls that Purdue got in the regular season finale, ridiculous. But I digress. It really is going to depend on in the NCAA tournament how officials call Zach Edey at both ends of the floor. Purdue games are going to be decided by that notion. I think maybe alone. We saw it a couple years ago. What was it? A few years ago, 2-3 years ago against Texas. They attempted something like 50 free throws in that game. And the officials kind of veered away from it against St. Peter's. Now, Peter's kind of played stylistically different than Texas at both ends of the floor, but I think the point still stands. Now, going back to my Big Ten tournament bet here, I played Ohio State, which you can find in our Discord channel. I bet them at 35-1 over at DraftKings. Remember to price shop over at thelines.com. So when we talk about motivation, Buckeyes have a lot of it trying to get into the NCAA tournament. Maybe 2 wins gets them in if they get to the semifinal. Much different story than last year's team, but I still think you got to get to the championship game. And then, like you said, you go all out at that point. But since February 18th on your site, Eric, Ohio State ranks 15th in the momentum metric over at Haslametrics. Top 50 in adjusted offensive efficiency since that date. Top 10 in adjusted defensive efficiency. And that start date coming back to when they fired Chris Holtmann and brought in Jake Diebler as one of the assistants turned now interim coaches. So you think about this team, Bruce Thornton and Gale, really, really good backcourt. Jamison Battle, one of the better three-point shooters in the Big Ten, but also in college basketball. Okpara gives them a lot of athleticism, and then you have depth with Zed Key behind him. And also Mahafy's defense, I think, would be an interesting factor in a rematch against Illinois just because Damask and the Illini do such a great job of creating mismatches offensively, maybe not defensively, with them ranking, bottom 100 in adjusted defensive efficiency over the last month. But one nugget that I found that was interesting, not only does Ohio State have experience of making a run in the Big Ten tournament, like last year, even though different story because 2 wins wasn't going to get them in, or maybe even 3. You had to win the whole thing. This offense over the last few weeks, since February 18th, when they beat Purdue, upset them on that Sunday afternoon, ranked before that, I should say. So backtracking a bit, from the start of the season, before the Purdue game, they ranked in the 2nd percentile of percentage points in transition. Since then, they rank in the 87th percentile. So not only is Diebler getting more guys involved in the rotation, like the freshman Devin Royal and Scotty Middleton, but Ohio State is playing much more up-tempo. So yes, maybe 3-point variance has gone Ohio State's way a little bit after they suffered a ton of negative 3-point variance before Chris Holtmann got canned. But Diebler's getting this team to run more in transition, and you have the guards to do it. So I like this team stylistically. And then when you think about the way the bracket shapes up, Iowa's on your side is a pick 'em. I would expect that line to open around that number 2. Tough game, but Ohio State lost by 2 at Iowa earlier in the season. That was a much different Ohio State team than what we're seeing right now. Then they get Illinois, who is very vulnerable defensively, like I mentioned, even though Terrence Shannon is a truck in his own right on the fast break. And then you would play, theoretically, if they get to the semifinal, Nebraska versus maybe Indiana or Penn State before you get to the other side in the title game. So I think the number is fair-ish. I make it closer to like 28-1. So not a huge edge, but you're not going to get a huge edge when you're talking about 35-1 versus 25-1, even when you're talking about implied probability. So I like the number. I took the Buckeyes. What say you on Ohio State?
Well, that's, it's interesting with that first game because up until that loss against Illinois, Iowa was kind of heading in the same direction. They had 5 straight games with positive game efficiency ratings. When I say that, that means they're playing above their season norm for 5 straight games. And then they fell back a little bit with Illinois. But really impressive stuff with Ohio State. I mean, obviously, like just changing out Holtman, it has, flipped the switch. That was a team that was all the way down. And I think it got as low as 126th in defensive efficiency. Today, they're up to 43rd, and that's a completely different thing than we're used to seeing from Ohio State. 2 seasons ago, let's go back 3 seasons ago, they were 88th in defensive efficiency. I was critical of them then. The year after, 109th. The year after that, 116th. And then they were hovering around 126th. The lowest they got there was somewhere around the start of February. And ever since then, they have been climbing up steadily. They've outperformed their defensive norm in 7 of their last 8 games. So obviously something is changing there under that guard. The difference is they're playing against a team that has also kind of gotten themselves back on the bubble. In fact, I had Ohio State briefly on the bubble and then they fell off kind of quickly. They didn't last very long, but Iowa really, really got close. They're still listed on my site in the first 8 out. The record does not exactly give them a, great resume look, but at the same time, I still think their resume is a little bit better than Ohio State. So whoever comes out of that game, again, we're talking motivation here, 2 teams that really need wins, and what better way to do it than beating Illinois. So I like that. I like your Ohio State pick, but at the same time, if someone threw some money on Iowa, that's another one I could definitely see happening. What goes against Iowa a little bit is they're so one-dimensional. Well, Iowa is 17th in the country in offensive efficiency, 139th on the defensive end. Ohio State, much more balanced, 52nd in offense, 43rd defensively. That's a much more balanced team there.
And when we look ahead to that Thursday matchup, going to be a great game in the second round of the Big Ten tournament, with it tipping off in its entirety on Wednesday in the first round, a couple games. When you look at Iowa giving up in conference play, I think it's the second or third most free throw attempt rate per game in Big Ten play. And when you think about their transition defense, they got ripped apart against Illinois on Sunday in a big spot for them. You mentioned their tournament hopes are on the line. A win there against the Illini on Sunday night maybe vaulted them into the first 4 in conversation, but they couldn't do that. But Iowa transition defense-wise, it's not just in that game in particular against the Illini. When you look at throughout conference play, they've been a bit vulnerable, especially against teams that could really push the tempo and have an elite transition offense, which I know Ohio State's full body of work doesn't show you that, but in the last few weeks, it's not just a variance thing with the Buckeyes. Coin flip game for sure in the second round of the Big Ten tournament against Iowa. I'll give you that, but they have changed their style of play, which is the kind of thing I look for when I'm taking a long shot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely understand that. And like you said, there's something to play for. They're a 10 seed. But definitely in the conversation. And obviously, how do you get yourself in the conversation a little bit deeper? You got to get those impact wins. Is Iowa going to be an impact win? Questionable. Illinois, without a doubt. And if you end up beating Nebraska, it bolsters your case a little bit more. My major concern is, like I said earlier, when is the cut line for when the selection committee is going to stop considering people? My thought is it's the end of Thursday night into Friday morning. If I'm not mistaken, so that championship game will be on a Sunday. That game against Nebraska would be on a Friday night, probably. So that they may not get to that point. The only game that might matter is going to be the Illinois win. So if they get through Iowa and they get through Illinois, that might be all the selection committee considers. And I'm just saying that from an at-large standpoint. Obviously, if they run the whole way, they're going to get in the tournament from an auto bid. But if you're talking from an at-large standpoint, Illinois might be the one game that gets through, and I don't know if Nebraska will. If that's the case, will that be enough to get Ohio State in the field? I have my doubts.
I'm with you. You gotta win the conference title game to get in for both of these teams, for Iowa and for Ohio State. And by the way, just kind of looking at this thing, zooming out, in the last few weeks for Iowa, like I mentioned, their defensive efficiency, especially transition defense, going back to the Wisconsin win in overtime. And I want to get your thoughts on Wisconsin really quickly before we get into a couple other conference tournaments, short conversations, and then get out of here on Outside Shots. Since February 17th, Iowa ranks in the 25th percentile of percentage of points allowed on fast break opportunities, and in the 13th percentile when you look at just straight up fast break points per game. So that's my big issue with the Hawkeyes, especially against Ohio State, or even if they get to the quarterfinals against Illinois. But would you give any love to your Badgers here before we get over to the Pac-12?
All I can say about Wisconsin is hopefully they got their bad stint out of the way. I mean, negative performances in 8 of their last 10. They've gone 3-8 over their last 11, I believe. A lot of people ask me and say, what do you make of this? And I kind of say this is kind of a little bit closer to the Badger team that we expected to see earlier on in the season when they were 16-4 after beating Michigan State, burying Michigan State in the Kohl Center. Everything looked rosy. They got up to number 6 in the country in the AP poll. And people were saying, well, I never saw this coming. I looked at the numbers and I'm like, how does a team change this much when it's the same cast of characters with the exception of A.J. Storr coming in to replace Jordan Davis? It was like the same cast of characters. What changed? I think we're seeing a little bit more of who Wisconsin truly is over the last month. I'm sorry to say that. Now, on the upside, I've always had faith that Greg Gard has his teams prepared for the tournament. They may land on that dangerous 5-seed line, and we've seen the last, like I said, Gard usually does pretty good in the tournament, but that 5-seed line, I have nightmares of that game against Oregon a few years ago when Oregon was the 12. I don't want to relive that again. I hope they come out of their funk, but maybe the best thing for them is to get their face beat in here, get out early in the Big Ten tournament, and give them a full week to chomp at the bit and be ready for the NCAA tournament. That might actually be the best thing for them, believe it or not. Sometimes losses are a good thing. I look at it that way. There's not a lot for Wisconsin to do here in this tournament. I don't think they're going to gain much. They're probably topping off at the 5 line. They're bottoming out maybe on a 7 line, but they're probably solidly on a 6 right now. Again, is there a lot to play for? Get right, get a week off, chomp at the bit, get ready for the NCAA tournament. That's my thoughts. I don't see a lot of success ahead of Wisconsin in the Big Ten tournament, but maybe I'm wrong.
Wrapping it up here with the Pac-12 and Mountain West Conference tournaments, both of those starting on Wednesday. And you look at the odds over at BetMGM, kicking off with the Pac-12 here. Arizona, minus 165, so similar to Houston, similar to UConn, very close to Purdue. Colorado, plus 500. Washington State, plus 600. Oregon, plus 1,400. Utah, plus 1,400. And USC has continued to get bet down at plus 1,400. They were in, I think, the 40-1, 45-1 opening odd range in this conference tournament. Trojans are the story right now, just with them being fully healthy and upsetting Arizona. I think they closed as an 8-point home favorite against them on Saturday. So I think that's where we should, that should be the one bet that people are going to make, especially if you could find a good number. Arizona, I'm not sold on in this conference tournament, nor am I sold on them in the NCAA tournament. What do you make of USC and their number?
7 straight positive performances out of nowhere. I mean, that's a team that fell as low as something like 115 for me. They've climbed back up into the 60s. So that's quite a turnaround. That's been obviously the team that I've picked as being incredibly disappointing. At one point this year, they were 11-17, but all of a sudden, you rack off the last 3 wins. Even in the losses, I mean, when you think about it, the losses they had, there was a double overtime loss to Colorado, who was a pretty good team. A loss at Washington State, who was a tournament team. You lose that game by 3 on the road. Even these are positive performances for USC compared to their season norm. So it seems like we've known all season long that USC has had the talent for whatever reason. They can't bring it together. And we see this before. We've seen it from Kentucky's and Duke's, where teams struggle in typically November and December, then usually get their act together. For whatever reason, USC has not gotten their act together for most of the season. But is it possible you can kind of be messed up for 4 months at a time, then all of a sudden finally figure it out right before March Madness comes? It's possible. The intriguing part is, like you said, they go and they beat Arizona by 13. And if they get through Washington, guess who they get again right away? They get Arizona. So if you can hit Arizona in the mouth early in that bracket, look at what else is left there. You got nothing else there that's really terribly impressive. Colorado up and down. Now they're dealing with some injuries. Washington State, can you possibly really trust them? Oregon, they're another team that's been killed by injuries, and they're the 4 seed. UCLA looked like they were making a run at one point, like they were figuring things out. Now they've fallen off again. It's really just kind of a lousy conference. It's good that the conference is coming to an end, actually, but it's interesting that USC is going to have a shot if they get through Washington. They just took down Arizona, and they're going to have a chance to do it again if they get through that one. I was thinking earlier, I might go as far as saying whoever wins that USC Arizona game is going to win the Pac-12 tournament championship.
Yeah, it's kind of a de facto, especially after what we saw over the weekend. I'd be remiss if we didn't talk SEC, of course, and It's a good transition just because you brought up Kentucky, and they're seemingly started to round into form, at least offensively. Tennessee plus 160 to win that conference tournament. Auburn plus 250. Kentucky plus 400. Alabama plus 500. Florida plus 1,400. A&M 40-1. There still are some bigger numbers out there, so be sure to shop around on A&M if you like their long shot potential over at thelines.com. Mississippi State 50-1. South Carolina kind of shows you where the market perception is on the Gamecocks, despite their success and maybe Lamont Paris being a Coach of the Year nationally candidate. They're 50-1. Ole Miss 100-1. The reason why I brought up A&M, and I know Kentucky had that huge upset win over Tennessee. Wildcats were able to space out the Volunteers, which is what Derek and I talked about on Outside Shots last Friday here on the YouTube channel and Apple, Spotify, wherever you find your favorite podcast. But kind of to the similar tune of a Wisconsin. Now, A&M isn't making the tournament, or they're right on the bubble, but a team that is very experienced and has some high variance tendencies with their ability to space the floor and generate second chance shots. But going back to the 3-point shooting, it hasn't been there for the most part this season when you look at the Aggies, but they have historical good, efficient 3-point shooters in Wade Taylor and Tyrese Radford. So overall thoughts on the SEC really quick, Eric.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of Texas A&M. I think they've had that bad stint where they lost 5 in a row. They seem to come out of it okay, but I think that's going to be too little too late for them. It's going to be interesting. You could potentially have Tennessee and South Carolina. I won't say that's exactly a tortoise game anymore. You know, Tennessee's picked up the pace a little bit, but it screams a little bit more defense, obviously, than what could unfold on the other side of the bracket, which is going to be a full-blown NBA All-Star game between Kentucky and Alabama. If I'm not mistaken, I think the score of that last game was 117-95. Just two teams out there that have, completely matching fingerprints when it comes to offensive efficiency and defensive efficiency. Like, both teams are right around number 8 offensive efficiency and then right around number 80 defensive efficiency. And that kind of thing, in my mind, screams first round upset in the NCAA tournament. Now, that doesn't necessarily translate to the conference tournaments. Offense can win, without a defense can win you conference tournaments. But boy, I really hate Alabama in the long term. I would not put a long-term bet on Alabama for the NCAA tournament. Could very well be wrong. But looking at the trends in the past, you got to have a competent defense. Kentucky has a similar problem. Kentucky can shoot a little bit better than Alabama. But boy, for me, I'm kind of getting off on a tangent here, getting ahead of myself, talking NCAA tournament. But boy, if there's a powerful team out there that I love to lose in the first round, regardless of opponent, it's Alabama.
I don't blame you. I kind of hope for my sake of Clemson futures, Final Four futures. I don't have them to win the national championship, but Clemson has a big road win at Alabama, non-conference wise. I'm kind of hoping that win gets bolstered a little bit by Alabama making a run of the SEC tournament, but that's just for selfish reasons. I agree with you there. Long-term outlook when it comes to the big dance does not look too optimistic. Maybe you win a couple games, but That's it. Looking at Kentucky really quickly here, Reed Shepherd being projected as a the number one pick, believe it or not, in the 2024 NBA draft. And what Kentucky did offensively over the weekend, they've won 5 straight games. Kind of an interesting team. 7 threes for Shepherd, by the way, against the Vols. I wouldn't put them in the same context as Alabama, but poor-ish defensive metrics. Illinois, same regard. It's kind of like the previous Iowa teams with Luka Garza. What do you make of Kentucky's long-term outlook?
Probably sadly similar to Alabama. Like you said, it's not quite as, I think they don't quite have the defensive deficiencies that Alabama has. I think they're a better shooting team than Alabama. But just looking at some of these numbers and it's so pedestrian across the board. And I not only just the adjusted 3-point percentage defensively, but also the 3-point attempt rate. 3-point attempt rate defensively, 247th in the country. Defensive adjusted 3-point percentage, 149th. These are really pedestrian numbers. You get to the mid-range, it's not much better. It's fine giving up mid-range shots, and the mid-range percentage is 27th, but a lot of people avoid the mid-range. And then you get it in the inside, the near proximity attempt rate, 171st defensively. Near proximity percentage, decent, but not great, 56th. 78th overall in defensive efficiency. That's not going to cut it. And that's the thing about it is, I probably have a similar outlook to Alabama when it comes to Kentucky. I don't like them. I don't like them getting out of the first weekend. Maybe they get the beneficial matchups, but it's another team that I just have a real hard time trusting. On top of that, number 291 right now on my consistency metric. You don't know what you're going to get from them from one night to the next. They could go on a run. They can flame out early. We saw that a few years ago when I think number 1 and number 2 in consistency 2 years ago were Iowa and North Carolina. Didn't want to trust either one of them, so I picked them to lose in the first weekend. Iowa paid off. I actually had money line on that game picking Richmond, and Richmond wins that game. But North Carolina, I didn't think they were going to get out of the second round. I think they were going to, they played Baylor in the second round, who was the 1 seed. They beat Baylor, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, they find their groove, win 3 straight, lose in the final. So again, just because someone is inconsistent doesn't necessarily mean it's going to continue, but it does seem to be an important trend more times than not.
I will defend Kentucky a little bit from a couple of years ago, because I had a national title on future on them at a big number. But you missed 12 free throws against St. Peter's, and Kellen Grady was dealing with plantar fasciitis. I think that was a couple weeks before the NCAA tournament, the start of it. So that's what we talk about, though, with high variance situations. They got a lot of negative variance in that game, whether it comes to the conference tournament or NCAA tournament. Sometimes that's the way she goes in a one and done.
Yeah, and it's really hard to say what exactly is going to happen in any one of these particular games. I just always look at that and say that's where I kind of look, when it comes to the NCAA tournament and picking these conference championships and everything like that, I kind of use the golf analogy of, drive for show, putt for dough. One of the things I always used to consume myself with was who's going to get this upset in the first couple rounds. That's when I turned things around last year and I look in reverse and say, now I'm picking backwards. I'm looking at the teams that have the best fingerprint. I know right now already the 4 teams that I've got in my back pocket waiting for the NCAA tournament, regardless of matchup, because I'm going that route. And then anything else beyond that, I go and say, pick them as a way because you can't really trust these teams. I can't trust Kentucky. I can't trust Alabama in the long term. They may very well get to the Elite Eight, but the money is made in the Final Four in the championship games. That's where you got to look for, and that's why I don't trust those 2 teams. Offense wins championships, that's great, but you got to have some defense, and those guys do not have enough in my book.
Really quickly to wrap, Eric, Mountain West Conference Tournament Odds. San Diego State, runner-up from last year's national championship game, plus 250. Utah State, plus 425, winning their first ever Mountain West Conference Championship outright, regular season-wise, over the weekend, I think. Nevada, plus 500. They're starting to peak, seemingly. Boise State, plus 600. New Mexico, same price. Colorado State, also plus 600. And UNLV, the exact same number. So it's not just you watching or listening that's saying, the Mountain West may get 7 teams in. Aren't they kind of close to even? Maybe between Utah State and UNLV and San Diego State being a little bit separated. The odds say the exact same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, throw a dart. Pick 7 teams and throw a dart. I mean, I'm going to throw out my rankings here for these teams. Boise State 32, Nevada 34, San Diego State 37, New Mexico 42, Colorado State 43, Utah State 56, and UNLV 65. I mean, you're talking about a difference of 33 spots between number 1 and number 7. Any of them could beat anybody on any given day. And after that, you jump down 90 spots to Wyoming, and then you got to go another 100 spots down from that to Fresno State at 256, Air Force 261, San Jose State 265. Let's take them off the table. But this is what makes this conference so interesting, is that it's really hard to say who's going to beat who on any given day. I love what Nevada's been able to do. I think Nevada's got a great resume. I think that's the cream of the crop. I've always kind of had a soft spot for Boise State, though. I think that Boise State, according to my rankings, is still the best team in the Mountain West. One of those teams looks like, in my opinion, the winner of this conference. Now, a lot of people from San Diego State are probably not going to want to hear that, but it's such a crapshoot with this conference. It's really difficult to say. I will say this: you talked about possibly 7 teams getting in. Now, San Diego State made a hell of a run last year, went 5-1 in the tournament. But if you take that San Diego State team out of the equation, going back over the last 4 tournaments, the Mountain West is only 0-11. If they're 0-11 in those last 4 tournaments, that's kind of in my mind, a very important point, because that may limit who actually gets in the NCAA tournament. So they could get up to 7. I think it's likely 6, especially when one of these top 6 teams wins. But say UNLV does win the whole thing, and does a team like possibly New Mexico get left out? That's going to be the question for me. The other question when it comes to these teams is seed lines. I have, like, a lot of these teams seeded pretty highly. I had Nevada, I think, near the 5 line, Utah State 5 or 6 line, San Diego State's up there as well. I wonder if that's a little bit too rich for the committee, considering that the conference is 0-11. And I'm like, I'm excluding San Diego State last year. They went 5-1. They deserve credit for the conference, but if you take them out of the equation, 0-11, the Mountain West has not had a ton of success in the NCAA tournament.
And I tweeted this to you on Friday. Mountain West teams, even including San Diego State's run to the championship last year, 36, 66-1 against the number in the NCAA tournament since 2003. Now, that is absolutely not to say fade the Mountain West in the Big Dance automatically, blindfolded. Please don't do that, just because matchups dictate a lot. But it goes to show you home court advantage means a lot in that conference because of the altitude level. It's not just Colorado State. It's Utah State and New Mexico. I'm probably forgetting one but at least with the Lobos in the pit. Now, really quickly in this conference, I don't have a bet. The only bets I have are Ohio State 35-1, Clemson 15-1, which I would bet down to 10-1. Thursday, big game in Las Vegas. San Diego State projected to be, per your numbers, not even. You have it projected as a pick'em against UNLV. And that's a huge game for UNLV's NCAA tournament hopes. And it's kind of home court. Let's say the market opens San Diego State -2, something like that. Do you think your numbers are accounting for maybe a little bit more, and rightfully so, I think, the maybe a little bit bigger than semi home court advantage for UNLV?
Yeah, I mean, and that game is being played on, I'm looking at this up here on the fly. I'm sorry about this, Thursday. And like, as far as the location goes, so it's going to be given a full, another thing I'll throw about my site is, like, there's a lot of times you have the home court advantage, you have the away games, but then you have like the small H's and the small A's, like the semi. There is no advantage like that on my site. I'm treating people, I get it. Unfortunately, my site doesn't kind of look at things that way. For example, like if you're playing a Gonzaga game that's being played up in Seattle against someone from Florida, obviously it's going to be a small H. It's a home game, but they're not at their home arena. It's kind of like that situation. So this game will actually be tracked, like you said, like a home game for UNLV. Keep that in mind, because that's the thing. So you're probably getting a little bit of an advantage towards UNLV. That's probably the question where you were going the first time. So you're looking at, so even though I have San Diego State in a pick'em, you're probably looking at adjust that by 1.5 or 2 points in favor of San Diego State. That's probably where you're going the first time. I just missed the question. So I was kind of scrambling, trying to answer something that made sense, and it didn't at all. So.
Well, You got it the second time around, which I respect. Not easy by any means, but he is Haslametrics at Haslametrics on X. One of the best, if not the best, college basketball analytics resource to go to over at Haslametrics.com. You can find all of his projections and all of my articles over at thelines.com. Remember, you could find our bets in real time in the Lines Discord channel. The link is over at thelines.com in the top right-hand corner. North Carolinians, Linians, whatever it may be, head over to thelines.com to get your sign-up bonuses since sports betting is now legal in North Carolina. No better time to do so. And anybody watching or listening can use promo code THELINES, one word, to get $150 in bonus bets with BetMGM Sportsbook if you bet $5. Promo code THELINES, one word. And remember to give the video a thumbs up and comment if you like Eric's projection on UNLV San Diego State, and if you're going to bet it. Just kidding, not really. Eric, any last words here on the show before we get out of here?
I have none. I would just say to everybody, enjoy the games this week. I said the fun really starts next week. It's my 3-day work week next week, and then I said Thursday and Friday it's me at the bar with my friends and family, and it's a good time. So should be a national holiday, but it's not. But if you can get the days off, enjoy the season.
He is Eric Haslam at Haslametrics. I'm Eli Herskovich. Eric will be back on our Sunday or Monday edition, whenever it's out, of our Round of 64 NCAA Tournament Bracket Preview. We'll be doing everything. So I'll be back on Friday morning for some quick semi-final conference tournament action, maybe even quarters in the Big Ten. But Eric will be back on with us on Sunday for the full NCAA Tournament Monday, whatever it may be, preview show over at thelines.com. So be sure to check that out, subscribe, rate, and review. Thanks for watching and listening. So long, everybody, and good luck on your conference tournament bets.